Victorians, they were so freaky, they were so weird, they had all of these strange preoccupations with death, and comparative to the way that we engage with death now, it's bonkers. But I think that they knew absolutely what they were doing, and they had a real curiosity with death. It wasn't necessarily a morbid fascination, but they had a day-to-day interaction with it.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Resurrectionists podcast. This week, we are joined by Frances Harvey. She has a BA in History from the University of Western Australia, a Bachelor of Design in Fashion Design and Textiles. She's worked in costume design and in fashion, and is currently doing a PhD at the University of Technology, Sydney, looking at burial dress in the Victorian period. So welcome to the show, Frances.
Hello, Regan. Thank you for having me.
I'm so excited to talk about this, especially because I feel like over the last season of the podcast, we've been mentioning the Victorians quite a bit in a lot of different
always
contexts.
Come up.
They're the weird, morbid, group. Everyone's weird and morbid, but the Victorians were very weird and morbid in history, I feel like.
Yeah, and I think it's also because it's so recent as well, and we have so much data from them, and we have so much information from that period. We have so many objects from that period in museums and stuff that just kind of has overwhelmingly encapsulated a lot of the way that we understand death. So yeah, I'm not surprised that it's been coming up in a lot of episodes.
I'm also personally excited because I've started studying textiles and stuff a bit at work, archaeologically,
fantastic.
Textiles, mostly it's just trying to identify them and stuff. So this is very exciting to me as well.
Yeah, amazing. That's something that I can do in a living context. I don't think I can do it in an archaeological context, but there's some really fascinating research about it. So it sounds really interesting.
Yeah, I literally it's kind of a weird tangential story, unrelated to the episode. But at the beginning of the year, there was a 2-day workshop going on in Copenhagen and archaeological textiles and how to identify them and stuff. And I just asked work, because I have a friend who lives in Copenhagen. So it was mostly just I want to go visit my friend. Can you give me 2 paid days off of work to go to Copenhagen and visit my friend? And I'll also go to this conference thing. And they were like, yeah, sure. That sounds good. Go take 2 vacation days. Have fun. They're CPD days. Go. And I was thinking oh yeah, it'd be grand. It's just something to put down for work to say I did training, but we never get textiles in. And then we've had 4 or 5 sites with textiles on them this year. I've been there 3 years. We've never had textiles before. And I'm what did I do?
Oh, so it's a sign.
I girl bossed too close to the sun.
Yeah,
I'm now in charge of this.
You manifested this. That's great.
I know, because the first one that came in, my supervisor was you have to write the report on that now. And I was I'm sorry, I what now? She was you went to the thing. And I was I spent 2 hours looking at something under a microscope. I don't think I'm qualified to do this. But
yeah,
okay.
This does not an expert make, but thank you for your vote of confidence.
Yeah, I'm there's no one to fact check me. So I say whatever I want.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
And I just always include the word possibly, likely, or maybe in it somewhere, and I'm good.
Yeah. Supposedly, all of that kind of stuff.
Exactly. Yeah, the thesaurus gets whipped out a bit when I'm writing these reports. So I wanted to ask you, your PhD is looking at burial dress and funerary kind of fashion in the Victorian era.
Yes.
So to get a bit of background beforehand, because I feel people who are into the morbid and the macabre and history and archaeology have probably seen photos from the Victorian period. They know what people are wearing. They may have also seen funerary photographs and stuff that people were taking back then. So they'd also maybe have an idea about what people were wearing a little bit for funerals. But is this something new to the Victorian period? Is it a modern thing that we dress the dead, do you know? Or have people been doing it since before then?
Oh, it is so old. It is one of, look, archaeology is not necessarily my cup of tea. I am more kind of recent stuff. But look, as far as I can basically ascertain and understand, all cultures across the world, for as long as we can really understand, have encased their dead in textiles in some way or another. Whether you're cremated or whether you're buried, you're dressed pretty much. There's not very many examples that I can think of. I'm sure people will refute me on this, but there's not many examples in which the dead are buried or cremated without clothing, basically, where they're naked. There's always some kind of, you're wrapped in a shroud. Jesus was supposedly wrapped in the Shroud of Turin. People were wrapped in cloth. Egyptian mummies were wrapped in, meters and meters and meters of linen. Sometimes people are dressed in their best suit. Nowadays, people might be dressed in a football jersey or a nightgown or something. So it has definitely changed over time, what people have been dressed in and potentially why they've been dressed. But for basically as long as humans have been humaning, textiles have been involved in their burial, which is quite amazing and something that, I'm incredibly fascinated by this whole idea that we put people in clothes and then we put them in the ground. And that's basically, that's kind of the foundation of my thesis, is that curious question. Is why do we put people in clothes and then put them in the ground? That's really odd. That's really fun and kind of interesting. And that's just sparked all of my research, basically.
Yeah, because it was one of those things that I just sort of presumed we bury people in their clothes now, so that we always did it. But then when I was coming up with questions and stuff for this interview, I was like, wait, hang on. Have we always actually done that? Or is this just something that I believe that we've done? Because then when I started to question it, I was like, yeah, actually in the past when maybe textiles were a little more, hard to come by or long lasting, that you'd pass them down and stuff. Why would you bury a commodity with someone to just have it, wear away?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's where the Victorian period becomes very interesting, because the problem is we don't really know when this happened, but there was a transition where people were usually dressed in something called winding sheets or shrouds. A winding sheet was basically a very large piece of linen or sometimes cotton, but usually linen. And they were wrapped almost like a burrito, burrito style, kind of wrapped up. And that's what they were basically wrapped in. That was a textile that they were basically dressed in to be buried. Because, like you said, clothing was a very high commodity and textiles were very costly, especially for middle and lower class individuals and families. It didn't make sense to bury someone in their best suit that then could be passed on to other family members because it was very valuable. But at some point in the Victorian era, but potentially at another point as well, maybe a little bit earlier in the 17th century, the 18th century, we kind of see this transition happening where people do start to get buried in living clothing effectively, as opposed to specifically clothing like shrouds or winding sheets that were dedicated for burial. They weren't used for people who were living their day-to-day life. No one actually wore it day to day. It was just kind of saved, made, prepared for someone to be buried in. And then sometime in the 18th and 19th centuries, we start to see this transition where people were actually buried in their own clothing that they did exist in their day-to-day life, suits, dresses. It's very common for young women, if they died around their wedding day or before they were married, to be buried in wedding dresses, so they would then, find a partner in the afterlife effectively. Or for some other reasons as well. And that's still common in many countries, especially across Eastern Europe at the moment as well. But there was this transition period that we can't actually pin a date down to, which is quite frustrating as a fashion historian, to kind of not really have the very clear data and answers on when this kind of transition happened. But all of the anyone who's kind of studying fashion or costume design, and I guess you'll understand this as an archaeologist, anyone who's studying fashion and costume design will see, have so many garments and things that they can look at in museums. People who are studying death clothing or archaeology, all of our data's in the ground. And so there's not a lot of information, especially when it comes to burial textiles, on when this kind of transition changed. When did people start being actually buried in their own clothing? But we do kind of understand that to know that it existed over the 19th century. thereabouts. And people have claims,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm not able to pin it down to anything just yet.
That was actually one of the questions I had for you was the research you're doing, is it purely archival based on like records and like photographs and stuff? Are you looking at like excavation records of maybe textiles that have been excavated from burials? I can imagine, I don't know about the areas that you're studying, but here we try not to dig up the Victorians. They're a little too modern for us.
Yes, a little bit recent. So it's a real big mixture. Because like I said, like, the clothing of the dead, it's very hidden from us, and because it was something that it's always been normal. It's always been something that has always happened. People have always like dressed their dead. Whenever you read like historical texts, especially around like funerary rituals, you'll always see like a line, and this kind of really frustrates me about my research. They'll have all these pages about kind of like the rituals of death and the deathbed. And then they'll have all these pages about the rituals of the funeral and what happens after death and all that kind of stuff. But then there's always like one or two sentences in the middle that says, and they washed and dressed the body for burial. And that's it. And they'll never expand on that, and they'll never give you details. And that is extremely frustrating as a historian. He's like, but what were they dressed in? What did they wear? And why did that matter? And even going through kind of like old, like oral history records, people will say things like, oh, and they dress the body in the usual way. I'm like, well, I don't know what that is. But I think it's because it was such a commonplace. It just kind of feels like a bit of an afterthought. It was a very commonplace thing to be done. It still happens today. And so because of its almost banality, it means that it's not harvested as something interesting. But in terms of the data, basically I need a mixture of things, like a smattering of post-mortem photographs, various like diary letters, like all of that kind of stuff, like written historical data. And I'm also doing archival research as well. So I went to the UK in June of this year, June and July of this year, and I went and visited a number of different museums, and I looked at some of the very rare burial garments that they have within the archives. Obviously, a lot of those garments don't necessarily survive because they go into a grave or into a burial chamber with a body. So it's very unusual for a burial garment, especially not an archaeological textile, to survive in a museum capacity. But there are a few around the UK that I was able to look at, which was very exciting. And so there are also the data from the Spitalfields excavation in like the 1990s. That's like one of the kind of like key archaeological data pieces that I have looked at, basically because it's an unearthing of like quite a few funerary textiles from between the 1830s to like the 1870s thereabouts, and that is some like really interesting data because it tells us that people were dressed in their own clothing and not necessarily quote unquote like burial clothing or clothing that was made specifically for burial.
Mm-hmm. And were people being buried just in clothing, or were there like jewelry and accessories? Like, was it a whole look that was going on?
People were basically buried with a whole range of different things. It very much depended on like socioeconomic status and the wealth capabilities of various families and what they were able to like put into a coffin or to be buried basically. But there were very many records of people being buried with mementos, photos, jewelry, wigs, false teeth. People would have their makeup done, they'd be washed, they'd be, prepared, they'd be scented. Like it was very much not just about burying someone and making sure that all of their rights or end of life care was done, but that they were presented and performed and that in a very unique and a very beautiful kind of way. A body was and still is always washed as well. Like this very intimate engagement of washing the body and making sure it is cleansed. That for many reasons is a hygienic thing, but I think it is also a ritual thing as well. And it's a very like intimate thing to be able to do to a body. And often they would have, because it was very common for family members to be laid out in the home. Most of the time now, when people pass away, they pass away like 90% of the time they'll be in a hospital or in a nursing home or away from the home. But back in the 19th century and earlier, people died in the home. They died around family members, and those. And the Irish wake is a very famous example of this, of presenting the body in the home to be farewelled over multiple days, and that prior to embalming meant that people had to be washed to make sure that the body didn't stink out the house too much, but also as a way to kind of like, ritually cleanse the body prior to burial, and then prior to them being dressed as well. Yeah.
And would it have been family members who were washing the body and dressing it and preparing it for the funeral?
Yes, absolutely. This is a really interesting part of history that I have kind of like uncovered for myself. Like, this is not new to anyone else necessarily, but I have discovered in the last 6 months, which I'm finding really fascinating, is the role of women in death care in the 19th century and prior to as well. So very much when we think about death care from like a 20th and 21st century perspective, we think about the role of the undertaker or the funeral director, which predominantly has been a very male-dominated industry and was very much a male-dominated industry from like the 1860s thereabouts onwards, when it really kind of starts to take off. But before then, death care was predominantly engaged in by local women, and they were referred to as laying out women. And they were often also nurses or midwives, not formally trained, but very much had these kind of like innate and also learned knowledge of healthcare, of healing, of just kind of like intimate social bonding and all of that kind of stuff. So your local, and especially in like local communities in non-urbanized areas, you'd have the local handy woman who was a, absolute jack of all trades, who was a midwife, who was a nurse, who, John dies in the middle of the night and you've got to go call Geraldine, and she's got to come, and she comes in the middle of the night and she knows exactly what to do, and she knows exactly what needs to be done, and she has all of the things that need to be prepared to be able to make sure that the body is washed. There's also a lot of like folklore around, some really interesting folklore around like death customs and what happens when the body dies, and when does the soul leave the body. So there's a lot of like interesting kind of like nuances around that. You often see it in like Irish folklore a lot, about, putting tobacco next to the body, or, making sure the window is open so that the soul leaves the home. Mirrors often have to be covered, or like, various different types of cloth are like tied on the front door so that family, like, community members know that someone in the house has passed away. But it was very much a community process of washing and dressing the dead. It was very much done either by the family, they would know what to do, or a local woman or a local series of women would come and basically engage in that work, and often not paid. Often unpaid work, right? There's a classic story of women in history. But then basically when the whole kind of like funeral trade really kicked off, and you can kind of like align this with a lot of like very interesting like, capitalist economic discussions. But that really kind of like took off as a men's trade, and that was very much like removed away from women and away from the home and away from the community as well. So often bodies were washed and dressed within the home, and that kind of remained there until they would go to the burial plot. But then you kind of start to get the middleman of the funeral director, or the undertaker, taking the body away to a third site, that then, a second site rather, before the burial. So that there's a kind of like a really interesting change economically that happens there in the latter part of the 19th century, which is interesting to discuss.
I do always sort of think of, I don't know if this is true or not, but I do sort of think of the Victorian period as being the kind of beginning of the commercialization of funerals as we see them now, with the, ornate coffins and big kind of ceremony and, wake thing and we don't do it as much now, but the big kind of impressive headstones, like massive carvings or like whole like vaults and everything for like single individuals to be buried in, and that kind of whole like industry surrounding it. I always think of kind of starting in the Victorian period. Is that true?
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. Like the funeral trade kind of, I guess, it started to exist quite before then, but it really kind of like kicked off in the 19th century. And like because previously an undertaker was like a handyman or a carpenter. They made coffins. Or they, made the accessories that kind of like went onto coffins. And there was this kind of like gradual introduction of them being like, wait a second, hold on, what if we kind of like, not that it necessarily was a thought process that kind of happened, but historically we can look back on it and see this kind of development change where funeral directing became like a job, and like there was very much of commercialization. Yeah, exactly as you said, very much of commercialization around death and the funeral. And a funeral used to be very, very simple, often operated through like a church. And people often didn't have coffins. In like the 17th century, it was far too expensive to have a coffin unless you were from like a wealthy family or aristocracy, and so people were just buried wrapped in cloth, basically. And then kind of like as industrialization and all of those kinds of things started to like ramp up into the 19th century, you see this kind of like very grand explosion of how one can present wealth, status, and basically performance through death rituals and death funerals. And that's where you can kind of see this like very classic, the black horses with the big plumes on their heads and these giant funerary carriages and these processions, and people having to wear black and constantly mourning. It was very much a performance, and like death and funeral was very much performance. And I think we can look back on that and say, oh, the Victorians, they were so freaky, they were so weird, they had all of these like strange preoccupations with death, and comparative to the way that we engage with death now, it's bonkers. But I think that they knew absolutely what they were doing, and they had a real curiosity with death. It wasn't necessarily a morbid fascination, but they had a day-to-day interaction with it, and because family members died in the home, and they had like a very, very intimate connection with death. And I think that a lot of history writing about the Victorian period kind of often frames them as this kind of strange oddity. And look, they did some whack stuff. I'm not going to disagree with that. That's fine. But I think that it sometimes discounts the fact that death was still upsetting. Yes, they did all of these, yes, heaps of people, died in the home, and child mortality rates were extremely high, and there were huge counts of like venereal diseases and people experiencing death all the time. And so a lot of histories are kind of saying, oh, the Victorians, they just kind of, they just got on with it, and they just knew, they just knew what to do with death, and they just kind of, existed with it, and they were fine. And I was like, no, they weren't. It was still upsetting. I think, but they were still very connected to it. And they had all these rituals and systems in ways that they could actually engage with death in ways that I would argue we're not very good at doing anymore, especially when I'm thinking about like an atheist kind of Anglo-Saxon approach to death is very void of this kind of ritual, which I think makes death bearable, basically.
Sure, wasn't it? I could be entirely wrong about this, but wasn't Queen Victoria in mourning after Albert died for the rest of her life? She wear black for like the rest of her life.
She took it really seriously, like really seriously. It wasn't necessarily encouraged that you mourned for that long, but there were quite a few like etiquette books on like how long you should mourn for, and how mourning was. The way we think about mourning now is it's very much behavior. It's like you mourn, and that's like an internal thing that you are doing, and you're grieving, and you're processing the death of someone, or you're processing, whatever you need to mourn. It's not not necessarily a death. But mourning to the Victorians was very much a performative action. It was something you did rather than something that you just kind of like internalized. And so there were all these etiquette books of, well, for the first, the first 12 months, you should wear X types of clothing and you can't wear this and you can wear that and you can only leave the house on a Tuesday. And all of these kinds of like rules and regulations. They were obviously very gendered and applied heaps more to women than men. Like a widow would have to mourn for like 4 years before she was able to marry or something ludicrous like that. I'm just kind of pulling that number out of my head. But a widower can kind of, crack on in about 3 weeks if necessary. So a lot of kind of like gendered performances around death. But yes, Queen Victoria very famously performatively mourned for 40 years. Or thereabouts after Albert's death and wore black until the end of her life. And when she was buried, there is actually a post-mortem photograph of Queen Victoria lying on her deathbed. And she is surrounded by so many items, including portraits of Prince Albert and various kind of like mementos from her life. And her wedding dress is laid on top of her. She's not wearing it, but it's laid on top of her body. And as far as I can tell, we don't know if she was actually buried in it. That's the kind of hard thing with postmortem photography is like it's a really fascinating angle from a fashion historian perspective of like we're literally photographing dead people. But we don't know if the clothing that they were wearing in that photo is the clothing they were actually buried in. So that's like a kind of a hard part about my research. But yes, there is a very beautiful but also quite haunting image of Queen Victoria lying on her deathbed, surrounded by stuff, lots of stuff.
Is it that people believed that, like, when they were burying people in these clothes, was it that they believed that like they would have the clothes with them in the afterlife, or was it just like for the living that they were doing it, not necessarily for the dead? Like, what was the thought process behind like, having everyone like in their clothes with all their accessories and everything?
Yeah, it's quite hard to say. I think that it's a mixture of both. I think that it kind of depends on your religious beliefs at the time, like what you actually considered to happen in the afterlife and whether you'd actually bring your stuff with you. I don't think that was necessarily like a universal perception, but certainly that has existed historically for a very long time, and across many cultures there is a belief that you are like transitioning into the afterlife with your with objects and your garments with you. But I think it is my perception of it, and this is a 21st century perception of it, is that it was much more for the living than necessarily for the dead. And it was, very much about like looking a certain way and almost looking alive, which is an interesting way of thinking about it, because there are these really amazing accounts of, people in their diaries would be like, there's this really amazing account of and I can't pull up a name from memory of someone who was like, oh, we went and saw a dead guy and he looked amazing. Like he looked really good. Like he was, and people commented on this, and that was really important to a lot of people. Is like, they looked great. Like their skin looked awesome. Their hair looked awesome. They were dressed. They looked really good. And what that version of like looking good meant that they often looked not dead. There was this perception of like what death looked like, and it was, very, very scary, and it often involved like injuries or blood or bruising or like, those kinds of things. And so it was very important for people to look clean and presentable because it was less horrific for family members or for loved ones to come and say goodbye to them. And so there are these accounts of people being like, that guy looked great. Like, what an amazing looking dead guy. And then there are the other accounts of being like, we went and saw a body, we went and farewelled someone, and they looked horrific. They looked so bad. And so it was no matter kind of like how you conceptualize the whole idea of like, well, it doesn't necessarily matter because they're dead and da da da, like all that kind of stuff. It definitely mattered to the living, and it definitely mattered at a time when people would actually go and very frequently farewell the deceased in communities that they looked a certain way, and that often meant that their hair was brushed or pushed off their face, or if they had any injuries or maladies, they were covered up. So people would often wear, if they weren't wearing their own clothing, they would be dressed in something called a shroud, which there are multiple different definitions of what someone might picture a shroud to be in their head. A shroud to me is basically like a very long sleeved nightgown, couple of frills, and often had a slit down the back. And that meant that it was a lot easier to dress the body, because a dead body is not very receptive to being dressed. They're not very helpfully, they're not cooperating. They're not very helpfully, popping their arms up or lifting their head. They're very heavy and often very resistant. And so having those kinds of openings, like an open back, and not having, cumbersome bits to them, basically, like these very simple nightgowns that basically just covered the entire body. It meant that anything that was not looking very good, because death doesn't always make the body look very good, was covered up. It was clean. It was white. It was a nightgown. It kind of gave this idea of someone just sleeping, having a rest, basically, even though intellectually family members would know that person's dead. They're not trying to be, tricked into this whole idea of like maybe they're alive. But there was very much this association with death as sleep and death as rest. And I think that was very much performed through people wearing nightgowns and shrouds that very much almost looked like a nightgown or like a christening gown. Like they looked very similar to a christening gown. Lots of ruffles and frills at the top, couple around the wrist, and just like a very long white gown.
And if people were going to wear, not a shroud, but like one of their own outfits, or, like a normal outfit, let's say, would they have planned that out before? Would the dead person have planned out perhaps like what they were going to wear? Would they pick out their outfit and their accessories? Obviously, in the cases of people dying young or unexpectedly, perhaps they wouldn't have had them planned out, but maybe would older people sort of start putting thought into that when they were still alive?
Absolutely, 100%. And so there are stories of young women who got married in a wedding trousseau. You often have kind of like, napkins and linens and stuff to prepare them for, domestic life, once they got married. And sometimes a part of that trousseau was a shroud, was something to prepare for in the event that they passed away one day, because that's obviously going to happen to everyone. So people would often have something that was, basically laid aside, or would have told family members like, hey, I want to be buried in X, Y, and Z. But before the period when we start to really see kind of everyone being buried, and when I say everyone, I'm talking about kind of like the Anglosphere, I'm talking about the US, I'm talking about the UK, I'm talking about places in Australia as well, because that's kind of where my research is focused. We really see before people were dressed almost exclusively in their own clothing, we do see people dressed in shrouds or nightgowns, which were often either laid aside, people would make them years in advance, pop them in a drawer, ready to go when the time came, or they would get them kind of like pre-prepared or pre-made by shroud makers or women or dressmakers in the community. A lot of women knew how to sew and sewed all of the time. Like basically that was like a very normal skill for people to have. And so in various etiquette books and sewing books, there are also instructions on how to make a shroud, or how to make a shroud cap, or how to make like this kind of basically backless nightgown, so you can sew it up, ready to go, pop it in a drawer, and when the time comes, your family will know where to find it and what you want to be dressed in. And so we can kind of see a real change as we enter the 20th century of people wanting to be buried in their own clothing, their living clothing, as opposed to clothing that was specifically made for the dead. But that's also coincided with less conversations around death and less conversations about what our actual wishes are as individuals and what we want to be dressed in. And so that's something that I find really fascinating about my research is when I'm talking to people, they're like, oh, I have never thought about what I would want to be dressed in. And I'm like, no, we don't really have those conversations necessarily anymore. I mean, I'm speaking very generally, but it's actually quite important for people to be having these conversations with family members. And I don't think it's a morbid thing, and I don't think it's a scary thing. It just prepares loved ones for the inevitable time in which someone passes away, and you don't have to make a decision about what someone is going to be dressed in while you're going through the worst couple of days of your life. You're able to actually honor their wishes, and to be able to have those conversations really freely in the lead up and not in moments of real difficulty, I think is very powerful and very important. And it's also I think it's fun. It's fun to have these conversations with people and say, how do you want to be remembered? How do you want to encapsulate your entire identity into one outfit? And for some people, it's a really obvious choice and they know exactly what they want to wear, and it's completely, yes, 100%. For some people, they could never even imagine having that conversation. Some people really like it as a kind of thought experiment. But I think it's a really important conversation that we need to be having, and a conversation that our ancestors 100, 150 years ago had those answers, and we don't have those answers anymore, which I think is a genuine shame. And so having those conversations with people, I think, is really, really fun and really interesting. I spoke to someone, this is a slight tangent. All of this is a slight tangent, but I spoke to someone recently who her mother passed away a few years ago, and she absolutely steadfast insisted that when she was buried in the suit that she met the Queen in the 1980s. And so she'd met the Queen for 5 minutes, literally curtsy, bow, whatever. And she kept that suit. And so she told her entire family, and she was like, that's it. That's the look. That's the fit. I want to be buried in that. And her family were able to honor her wishes, and they knew that's exactly what she wanted to be buried in. And it's a funny one nowadays to think about, because you're like, well, I don't know how many people actually saw her. It's not very common for people to have an open casket anymore, or even a viewing. But there was an intellectual knowledge within that family that she was wearing exactly what she wanted to wear. And I think that was really powerful for the family, which is quite amazing.
It is interesting to think about, because I kind of, I mean, I come from a slightly more morbid background than the general public, but I do have my own funeral planned out, how I want to be buried, what I want to be buried in. I've told my family. It's not because of any particular reason. I just fell down a rabbit hole of eco funerals and then decided that that's what I wanted. And then when I told my mum that that's what I wanted, she was like, well, I want that too. And your dad has to go next to me, so he's getting that too. So that portion of it, if, God forbid anything happened to my parents, I know how they want to be buried, but I would have no clue what to put them in. I imagine my father would not care very much. I imagine my mother would, but I could go into her closet and stare at everything and be like, I don't know, did she like that dress? Did she not like that dress? I can't remember. What do I put her in? Do I buy her something new? Or even me, I planned my own funeral, and yet I don't know what I want to wear either. I could open up my closet and be like, none of this. I don't know. Should I buy something new? It is a portion of it that I've never thought about.
Yeah, see, that's the thing. It's always it's that sentence, that we were washed, they were washed, and they were dressed. And it's well, what were they actually dressed in? And because a funeral director, regardless of what kind of a funeral you have, will always ask the family to provide clothing. And I think the other interesting one is do you provide underwear? I don't think, you know what I mean? It doesn't really matter, because underwear very much has a functional use. And once someone has passed away, when they're dressed, like their underwear no longer serves that same functional use. But also there's something a bit strange about the thought of not putting someone in underwear. But also I don't know if I particularly want to be buried in a bra, like that just doesn't sound great.
No, it was uncomfortable enough in life.
Yes, exactly. I certainly don't want to be that in death. And I think that there's some like really interesting kind of like from a fashion perspective, like these really interesting kind of like philosophical thoughts about what fashion is and like what clothing exists as and what it does. And in life, clothing protects us and it keeps us warm, it cools us down, we sweat in it, we're able to like get it dirty, we're able to like move around in it and run and walk and like do all of these different things, and we live our lives in it. And it's meant to move and it's meant to float and it's meant to be light, or it's meant to, protect us from the rain and all this kind of stuff. It does none of those things in death. It doesn't need to. It doesn't need to move at all. Like it doesn't need to be, there are no issues. A dead body doesn't sweat. A dead body doesn't move. A dead body is not going to wear it out. Like it's not going to, poke holes in it or anything like that. And a dead body is certainly not going to be very helpful when it comes to dressing. And so you can kind of have these really interesting thoughts about like, well, what function does clothing actually serve in death? Because functionally, it doesn't do the same things that living clothing does for us. But it's still important and it still matters because it still is this kind of like symbolic cultural encasing, wrapping of the body. And it's the way that we view the body as well. When you picture a human, when you picture your loved ones, you might, I'm not going to judge anyone, but like you often don't picture them naked. You picture them clothed. Like that's our perception of individuals. And so I think that when we think about like how someone is going to be, presented for death, regardless of whether we believe it's necessary or not, I don't think we can really imagine a dead body not being dressed. But then to make the decision for another person, I feel is very hard. And I think that a lot of families really struggle, especially in a time when you're not necessarily prepared for someone's eventual death. And you have to make that decision of like, oh my God, like, was this my mom's favorite dress? Like, does she want to be wearing that? Does it matter to her? Should I buy her something new? I'm not sure. And I don't think there's a right answer at all, because it is all incredibly personal. But I do think that having those conversations is really handy and really amazing. My grandfather passed away, not last year, but the year before, while I was working on my thesis. And because I had already been working on this for a little while, I'd already been having conversations with my mum about burial dress. And when he passed away, I spoke to her and I was like, well, what do you think he should be dressed in? Like, what do you want him to be dressed in? And she was like, having the conversations with you about this made it so much easier because I had already started thinking about it. And she was like, he always looked good in a suit. He always looked amazing in a suit. And so I want him to be buried in a suit. And even just that small, like 5-minute conversation was enough to kind of like make it a lot easier, which I think is really amazing because it matters. And I don't think we want to believe that it matters because it kind of feels weird sometimes. But I think it matters that we are dressed and what we are dressed in. And we can't necessarily put our finger onto that.
It is like a kind of, especially nowadays, I feel like fashion is a very like outward indicator of like who someone is, what they enjoy, like what fandoms they're a part of, if they're wearing like graphic tees, or what sports teams they follow, what maybe like groups of, aesthetic or whatever they fall into. And it can be a way of like showing the world like, this is who I am, this is what I like, this is how I want the world to perceive me. So is there like, in the Victorian period, would you be able to see that kind of same maybe indication of who people were based on their clothes? Like, I'm presuming there's socioeconomic differences between what people are wearing as well. But is there also like a personal touch to be like, oh, this person, maybe liked this or was this kind of way in life?
I think the hard thing is we don't really know. We don't have enough data to really support exactly like what individually people were wearing or the specifics of it. Like there are some kind of like stories we do have about what people were chosen to be buried in that are really useful and a part of that. But on the grand scheme of things, we actually don't know because people didn't really record a lot of that information. And I think that there was also that sense of individualism and that sense of like a solo identity didn't really exist in the same way that we can kind of like perceive it in the 20th and especially the 21st centuries where it's basically all about the individual, which you can kind of see through like social media and stuff like that. But there wasn't really as much of it was more of like a community perspective, and it was more about the dressing was more about like tradition and ritual and kind of like what was done as opposed to necessarily this really outward expression of who someone is through clothing. I'm sure there were definitely instances of specific moments of someone having their favorite flower in their lapel, or those kinds of, or a favorite ring, or like a photograph of a loved one tucked inside a pocket, like those kinds of things. But in terms of this kind of like very outward manifestation of like an entire individual personality, it didn't exist in the same way. And so I just don't think you could ever really perceive that in the same way as you would now. And that was kind of like one of the big changes, I guess, that happened through the 20th century was this perception of individuality over kind of community conformatism, I guess.
Mm. And were people being buried, like people who were being buried in their living clothes, would it have been like your Sunday best, like the best thing that you own, or would it have been like, this is just what I wore every day and that's more me kind of thing?
Yeah, I think it was, from what I can gather from kind of like the data that we do have, it was very much, if they were buried in their living clothing, it would be Sunday best. And that was very much the phrase that was kind of like constantly used. And it's something that we don't really think about anymore, but like it was like the suit that you had, or like the nice tea dress or something like that, if they were buried in their own living clothing. An interesting one that you kind of don't really think about is shoes. And I think that there were definitely cases where people were buried in, their suits and their shoes, or like a pair of heels or something. But prior to that, when people were being buried in shrouds or basically just nightgowns, it was very common for people to be only buried in socks, and so not buried with shoes whatsoever. And that kind of comes back to the idea of materials being very costly, and so it wasn't necessarily a good economic decision to bury someone in shoes. That were very useful and not necessarily deemed necessary for death. And so it was very common for people to have stockings or like long hand knitted socks that they would sometimes even knit themselves, and like have them laid out for burial, which is quite a beautiful thing.
It is very much giving cozy pajama vibes, like just your nightgown and your fluffy socks.
Yeah, I think that was it though. Or like, and a little cap on your head as well. Like it was, I think it would have been comfortable. I think that was kind of like a part of it is like, it was very easy to dress a body in those kinds of garments because it doesn't require a lot of intervention from wiggling arms and those kinds of things. But it was comfortable, and it was easy. And I think that even if people weren't able to intellectualize that was something that was important, I wouldn't be surprised if that was very much like a back of the brain kind of thought of being like, well, we want them to be comfortable. We want them to be resting. We want them to be at peace. Like all of those kind of phrases, at peace, at rest, when we talk about death. And I think that very much comes with how you could then envision that person feeling in that moment. And that often comes down to comfortability, which means, having your head rested on a pillow or something like that. And then it comes down to the clothing, like having warm feet. And that sometimes the sock thing comes up in like folklore as being like, well, if they weren't wearing socks, it means that they'll get cold feet and they, uh, something, interesting folklore to do with ghosts, and like they would not be at rest and they wouldn't be able to, the soul wouldn't be able to happily leave into the afterlife and all those kinds of things. So you can kind of like take that what you will. There's a lot of like very interesting kind of like small threads and stories that come through that. But I do think it comes down to comfort and wanting someone to be comfortable, regardless of whether you understand them to be dead or alive.
And would there have been any major sort of differences in what people were wearing when they were buried between religious groups, or is this kind of a overarching like social thing that like everyone was, in their shrouds or their Sunday best, or was it specific religious groups were more or less likely to do it?
Yeah. So my research is specifically across the UK in the period of time when Christianity was really having a bit of its heyday. So I can't necessarily speak for anything that kind of like doesn't kind of come under the big Christianity umbrella. But there were definitely certain sects or certain like, yes, very small groups that had their own distinguishing features. So, and this is especially in Ireland, is Roman Catholics were often buried in brown shrouds, like there was a colour, and there were other groups that were buried in blue, and that was like very important. They were buried in blue because often shrouds were made of linen or cotton. They were white, they were clean, and so they often kind of all basically looked the same, more or less, from what we can understand. But Roman Catholics would often be buried in brown, and that continued very much into the 20th century. Other groups in other colours as well, or they'd have like a certain thing or aspect to the shroud that would kind of like denote them as part of like a certain group. They might have like a certain like stripe or sometimes a little emblem on the front, like a Sacred Heart emblem or something like that kind of like associated them with a certain religious group. But in terms of like the actual shapes of the garments, other than the color and maybe some distinguishing features, they were pretty much the same. It was still the kind of like nightgown look, but sometimes it was just colored differently, more or less. So it's actually like for a period of time where, and for a sects of religion that often have like quite differing approaches to things, it was something that remained quite universal, which I think is quite amazing in that way. There was like a slight universal blanket to it.
Yeah, like we all agree that we're going to do this, but like you get this color and I get this color. And
yes, but we're going to do it slightly differently, and that is important. But we're all agreeing that like long sleeve nightgown, that's it. That's the look. That's what we're going for.
So do you have a favorite garment or a favorite maybe like, story of burial from your research?
I do. I love this question. Thank you. Yes, I have a favorite garment, and it's a pair of stockings. And these stockings are in St. Fagan's, the museum the Natural Museum down in Cardiff in Wales. Beautiful museum. It's a fantastic place. And they have this pair of like hand knitted woolen stockings. They're very itchy, and I'm sure that they would be very uncomfortable to wear. But they're white, and they have this red banding around the cuff of it. And it says Eliza Lewis around the edge. And what we know about these socks is that they were made by this person, Eliza Lewis. And so she lived on a farm out in the west of Wales, and she had sheep, and she used their wool to spin yarn and knitted these socks in preparation for her burial. And she knitted her name around the top of it, almost like a sports sock, like having Nike or Adidas or something. It said Eliza Lewis around the top. And when she passed away in like the late 1800s, I think the socks are from about the 1850s. When she passed away, she had quite a bit of swelling in her legs, and it meant that the socks didn't fit. And so that's the reason why they're in the collection. So she never wore them. It was they were kind of handed down to her through her family, and one of her nieces or great nieces in the 1940s donated them to St. Fagan's. And so that's how we have them in our collection. Unfortunately, she was never able to be buried in these socks that she specifically made to be buried in. And there's this beautiful archive piece because one, it's this amazing story of a woman who just very painstakingly knitted these socks for her own death. And also, as archivists, I guess we're very lucky to be in possession of these socks, because if she didn't have swelling in her legs, we never would have seen them. But I guess the sad part of the story is, for me as a researcher, is I don't know what she was actually buried in. I know she was not buried in these socks, but I don't know if she got another pair made, if she made another pair, if she wore something else, if she had to get something that was manufactured. So, there were manufactured places where people go out and buy these items to then be buried in. So I'm not sure what she was actually buried in, but they're my favorite garment for sure. Mainly because they've got the best story attached to them. A lot of these garments kind of come into collections, and because they don't have immense historical value, they don't often come with a story. And so you're often speaking to curators and they're like, oh, yeah, I don't know about this one. We don't really have much information. And this was kind of one of the ones that had a little story attached to them. Eliza Lewis's stockings, they're my favorite. For sure.
I love that. That's so cute. It's so sad that she didn't get to wear her hand-spun, hand-knit stockings with her name on them.
I know. I'll send you a photo of them. They're really nice.
They sound so adorable. I kind of really hope that she knit herself another bigger pair that she could wear in her grave.
That's the story that I'm telling myself, is that she knew she was getting the swelling in her legs, and just kind of whipped up an extra large pair for herself. That's the story that I'm choosing to believe.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with that story as well.
Yes.
So something you mentioned there about, getting manufactured socks instead, potentially. Would things like that have been general manufactured clothing that living people also would have worn? Or was there a specific industry kind of being built up in this period for funerary clothing, or was it all handmade? I know you were saying that there was sewing patterns for shrouds and stuff, but was there also maybe industry building up as well?
Very much so, 100%. So alongside alongside the industry of funeral directing and funerals and carriages and the whole shebang that kind of came with it, there was also the mass manufacturing of shrouds or burial garments, whatever, or burial dresses, kind of whatever phrase you want to use to describe them. And there's all clothing is handmade clothing. So it's always a funny kind of phrase to use, because it's there's no machine that can make a item of clothing from scratch. But yes, there was very much an industry that kind of existed, especially in the latter half of the 19th century, where funeral directors were supplied with mass manufactured shrouds or other burial garments, burial outfits, basically, that they could then sell as part of a package, as part of a funeral to someone. So if you buy the gold standard funeral, it includes, one coffin made of oak, and it includes this, and it includes that, and it includes 4 pallbearers, and it includes, a special cloth and a mantelpiece, and you can just tick the boxes of all the things that this funeral includes, and it costs you X number of thousands of pounds, and bing, bang, bong, there you go, you've got a funeral. And one of those things that was often included was a shroud. So sometimes it was included, you would purchase it through the funeral director and they would provide it. And that was a mass manufactured product, but also still sometimes part of a cottage industry or a small industry of women who would make these and then supply them to funeral directors, or family members would supply them themselves, either going out and buying them, making it themselves, or then choosing to be dressed in something that of their living, their living clothing, basically. Yeah, but it is very interesting to think about these kind of purpose-made burial garments, these garments that were made specifically for burial. You wouldn't go out and be able to wear it normally. mainly because it often didn't have this like functional aspect to it. A lot of shrouds can kind of be mistaken for nightgowns because they often were just nightgowns. But as you start to see it become more and more mass manufactured in like the late 19th century, and early 20th century, you almost start to see a breakdown of garments. And so I was mentioning the shrouds with the slit down the back, obviously easy to tuck around. But it got even to the point where there was no back whatsoever. It was literally it was barely a garment at that point. It was the front piece. It was like a rectangle with frills and stuff down the front. And you basically just lay it on top like a sheet, tucked it around the sides, and it looked like you were wearing something, but you actually kind of weren't. And the same with the sleeves. It was like a very open piece, like a rectangle that was then wrapped around and tucked underneath the arm. So it looked like you were wearing a sleeve, but like if that arm was lifted up, it would completely fall away. And so that kind of comes back to the point about like clothing being performative as opposed to being functional in death. And there's this kind of thought that I'm having. I haven't really written about anything about it at the moment, but this idea of shrouds is the first kind of fast fashion, basically, as something that was very much made to be disposed of very quickly. And you kind of start to see that when I was looking at a lot of the garments when I did my archival study in the middle of the year. You kind of start to see that in the way that garments were actually made. They were made really quickly. They were made with very loose stitches, or these big kind of like tacking stitches that don't have any strength whatsoever. Like if you had any resistance against it, it would snap. But that's not necessary in death. You don't need to be able to move your arms around. And so you kind of see these like very quickly made garments that had raw edges and like didn't need to be finished properly, that were then able to be like tucked around bodies, and they looked like you were wearing a nightgown or a shroud or whatever it might be, but it certainly would never have functioned as an item of clothing. Worse than a hospital gown, like just not going to do much for you.
It is giving like Shein or like Temu or something like that.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, and
it looks good for a night out, but it will fall apart by the time you get home.
Yeah, because it wasn't made to be functional. It was made to be disposed of. It was made immediately for someone to be dressed in, looked at, and then a lid to go on the coffin and go into the ground. So it didn't need to be really nice, or it didn't need to, it just needed to look a certain way. It needed to achieve some kind of aesthetic preparation of what someone looked like. It needed to have all of the bells and whistles that made it look like it had a collar or it had buttons, but the buttons weren't functional. Like it had all of these kind of like little moments, these little looks. But if you actually tried to wear it as a garment, it would have fallen to pieces because it's basically just three rectangles.
I'm now wondering if that's where the faux button thing came from, because I feel like so many like dresses and stuff now have like buttons down the front, but you're like they're not even buttoning anything. You've just put buttons on. There's not even fake loops to like go through.
Yeah, exactly. Which doesn't make any sense. Like, why put the effort into putting fake buttons on if you're not going to even like just pop a couple of holes in? It just doesn't really make any sense. Or just don't put them there. I just don't understand that. It's a bit odd.
It is a bit odd. So I feel like I could discuss this with you forever because this is so interesting. But for everyone who's listening, it's like what, 10:30, 11 o'clock in Australia, where you
it's
are
almost 11 for me.
And I will have edited this out, but the lighting is already shut off. We've already been told to
exit the building.
Yes. So before we finish up, is there anything that we haven't discussed yet that you feel like people should know?
That is such a great question. I feel like we actually touched on quite a few. This is one of the topics that I could go on for forever. I could just kind of keep going and keep remembering tiny facts and going, oh, have you heard about this? And you've heard about that? Blah, 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 blah. I think the thing that what I really like talking about with my work is not just what people were buried in, but kind of like thinking about this entire community and culture around who was making these decisions around, what someone was buried in, the family members, but also who was making these clothes and like doing this work. And it was a lot of these kind of like unsung female heroes of like local communities, the laying out women, and also the shroud makers. And it was the women who were making these clothes almost exclusively for burial. And it was like this whole community that existed, and this whole almost like industry that existed. And as a researcher, there's not a lot of information out there. Like if you start to Google shroud makers, like there's not a lot of information there. It's very much hidden within the historical record. But we know that everyone who died was wearing clothing. Even at a pauper's funeral, they were wrapped in something. There was some kind of item of clothing or textile that was wrapped around the body. And that item of clothing or that textile came from somewhere. And that often was made by a woman. And it was often made by a local seamstress, a dressmaker, whatever, like a needlewoman, kind of like whatever you want to call them. And I think that there's this real kind of like missing part of history that we're kind of, I'm already talking about when it comes to burial clothing. There's not a lot of research about kind of like what people were buried in and why that mattered and why we can care about it. And I think within my research, there's this like added layer that I'm trying to pull in, this added thread of like these women who very much contributed to that. And it just kind of makes the story richer and more interesting. And then you have these individual stories about Eliza Lewis's stockings that just make it all the more fascinating to think about as something that was very much someone's personal history, as opposed to this kind of like overarching statement about like, weren't the Victorians kooky? Which I think is also true, but it's nice to think about it in a more normal way as well.
Yeah, it does dawn on me as a rather like interesting insight that you don't normally get into like individuals and stuff and history as a whole, to be looking at like what people were buried in and kind of what that says about society and people's beliefs and the different roles that went into this whole industry and stuff as well.
Yeah, and something that still exists and something that still happens and will continue to happen probably, I would say, for the rest of time, because I think no matter what we think about it and no matter how funny I think people can find these kinds of discussions or like how odd it is, especially if people aren't necessarily religious and aren't considering an afterlife, it can kind of feel a bit strange to kind of think about. It matters. It matters what we're buried in, and we can't necessarily explain that. And I think there are so many reasons why it matters. And you can list a whole bunch of them. It's dignity, it's respect, it's about individualism, it's about tradition, it's about culture, it's about society, whatever it is. But regardless, I think it matters. And I think that's really beautiful.
Yeah, I think that is a beautiful sentiment to end off this episode on. So thank you so much, Frances, for coming on. This has been such an interesting conversation.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. I could keep going on forever, so it's probably best that you stop me at this point.
You have to get home at some point. I can imagine it's quite dark by now.
It is very dark. I do have to get home.
Well, thank you for being on, and thank you for the listeners for tuning in. I will see you all in next week's episode. Goodbye, guys.